Well, folks, let's go into Furman's drugstore here. I just gotta say that Dick Furman was a gentleman that came out here after I'd gotten 2 or 3 of these exhibits done. Was in the grocery store. I held up a 1x10, 12 feet long, with my head to try and nail it. I didn't have a nail gun. And he walks up to me and he says, "Can you use some help?" And he was out here for 9 to 10 years, almost every day, helping out here. The wonderful man has now passed on. So come on in. Spread out a little bit here. These counters in here were made in Sheboygan, Wisconsin in 1908 for the Olathe drugstore. So all of these, you notice the marble on the bottom and the curved one over here with the marble on it, that was all out of the Olathe drugstore. The ceiling's almost identical, except this one's from a house of ill repute called Ma Zeller's in Cumberland, Wyoming, outside of Evanston, Wyoming. And if you notice, there's bullet holes in it, and you'd sure like to know the story behind each one of those bullet holes. Before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, you could bottle about anything. You could bottle about anything. There were 55,000 patents for medicine before 1906, and they were false cures, almost all of them. They passed that law in 1906, and that narrowed the field down. There are 2 rows of medicines up here for constipation and diarrhea, and there's one up there for both, which is a stalemate. But they say there is a new one on the market now that will work for both, and so I won't go ahead and explain that. But anyway, so after that act, the medicines had to state their what they would cure right on the label. So down here we have these bitters bottles, and it's an interesting story. When Brigham Young, the Mormon prophet, he had a brewery, and when he passed away in 1877, I believe that's the year it was, the church frowned on alcohol, the LDS church, and they still do, and they eventually banned alcohol altogether. But they were good LDS folks, and they rationalized that if they drank bitters, they would be drinking for medicinal purposes, like prickly ash bitters for stomach and bowels, constipation and flatulence. And they had more alcohol in them than our whiskey today as a rule. So anyway, the big towns in Utah, Salt Lake, Ogden, Provo, were well laid out with wide streets for a wagon and a team to turn around instead of going around a muddy block and around to get back. And they had garbage collection like we do today. Somebody would come to your curb and get it rather than you having to take it to the dump. And they didn't want that garbage man, today the sanitary engineer, I guess, to report to the church they were drinking anything with alcohol, so they would throw them under their homes. And I was a state archaeologist in Utah, and for a number of years, in my spare time, I'd crawl under the old homes, and I found many of these bitters bottles under there where they hid them so that they wouldn't get reported to the church that they were drinking anything with alcohol. This one here is an exception, bird bitters. Add 1 drop to bird's water, result a very cheery bird, alcohol 26%. So you had a drunk canary. And a man came in here that worked at the Empire Mine down in Uray and in the 1940s. And he stayed in the boarding house, and up on the bar in the boarding house was a sign, "Watch out for the parakeet." And the parakeet only knew a couple of words, and that's "Give me a beer." And he carried around a thimble like you darn socks with, or used to darn socks with, in his mouth, and the guys would pour beer in it. But he said you had to watch out because by 10 o'clock at night, that parakeet would be on his back with his feet sticking up in the air and you might step on him. And people often say that's not a true story, but I've heard it from several sources that it was a true story about that parakeet. Kind of an interesting little story. So down this way, Okay, so I want to point out these little penny dolls right down here, folks. They're called frozen charlottes, and that term spread all over the world around 1900 to 1910. And the story goes there was a young girl in Maine in a horse-drawn sleigh, and she had a beautiful dress on, and she didn't want to put her coat on. She wanted to go down the street and let everybody see her beautiful dress. And in fact, her arms froze then to the metal armrests on the old sleigh, and thus the term frozen charlotte. Now back here we have the pharmacy, and down near the floor you'll see all of these cylinders with actually prescriptions on them on coat hangers. That's how they filed them in the old days at the Olathe drugstore. And what if you wanted to get your prescription refilled? How would you know where to look in each one of those stacks? There's no little tab on it that says what month, what year, whatever. So I don't know how they did it, except he probably had a separate log that he kept the names in or something like that. So anyway, and if this was a larger drugstore, they would have probably had a soda fountain after 1900. And if a young girl came in, well, like yourself there, if you came in and wanted to get a soda and you smelled all this medicine, it would turn you off and you'd probably run out. That's one of the reasons why they had tobacco in a drugstore, because that tobacco smell was fresh and it would overwhelm the smell of the medicine. So anyway, all right, well, we're going to move on down the street and see what we partake of next. If you have a question, just holler out as we're walking, and I'll try to answer them.